Welcome to Dr. Dan's Freedom Forum. For most of us, history appears to travel in a linear course. That is because as individual humans, we only see a very short piece of history during our lifetime. But historians and those who study history understand that history is cyclical. It does travel in cycles that repeat themselves over and over again. What that means is that if we were to be able to learn from history, hopefully at some point we could stop making the same mistakes over and over again. These days, history is instantaneous. With the digital media and the digital media revolution as we have it, everything that we say, either in public and even most of the things we say in private, can be recorded forever, recorded in essence for posterity. Recorded for posterity. And thus we have a record of what we say, and it can be compared. The future, what we say in the future, can be compared to what we have said in the past. There's never any question about whether you said something because it is there in digital media, preserved forever and ever. How different was it back in the days of the Revolutionary War, or in the Civil War, or in previous times in the history of our country, when the only way to record history was by writing it down on a piece of paper? So you can imagine if it was written down very quickly, it was probably relatively accurate. But anyone who's tried to write down the speech of someone who is speaking, such as writing down what I'm saying to you right now, there's no way that you could really write fast enough to get every single word down exactly as I'm telling it to you. If enough time went by, an hour or two or a day or two, it is very unlikely that what you would write down would be exactly or even necessarily close to what I am saying right now. So you have to take a look at history in that context. What we are able to obtain from history is filtered through a level of interpretation that various history inscribers are able to put to it. The gentleman that we're going to be speaking to in this series of programs has my admiration because he went and looked for the original documentation so that he could look at history as close to the original as possible. This is very important because if we don't look at the original documents, then what we see in books and magazines today is an interpretation of someone in today's world looking at something in the past, and it may not be right. But if you go to the archives and you look at the original documents, then you have a chance of trying to really understand what people said and maybe even understand why they said it. So my guest is John Ainsworth. John is a student of history. He has gone to the archives. He has researched his subject, and his subject is the Constitution, the origins of the Constitution, and the origins of the history of the Civil War era and Reconstruction more properly. In this series, he's going to discuss with you how certain parts of the Constitution that we now accept today, how they came into being, and discuss whether or not they are actually constitutionally decided upon, whether they were instituted in a proper constitutional way. So I would like to introduce to you John Ainsworth. John, good to see you, and thank you for coming on the program.
Great to be here.
You know, one of the things about history is today, when we're talking about history in the modern time, history is instantaneous. with the digital media, with camera phones and video, there's almost nothing that is not said, either publicly and in many cases privately, that is not recorded, and in the digital sense, recorded for posterity, whatever posterity may be, but nevertheless, it is recorded forever. But you have dealt with a time in history in which there was no digital media. And really, the history was a person-to-person, first-generation type of history where if it wasn't written down by someone at the moment who was actually there, and even then that was subject to error, if time elapsed from when someone said something to when it was recorded, there was error, and there was a certain amount of interpretive history at the time.
Absolutely.
So when we go back and study history, as you have, you're dealing with documents that were created by hand based upon conversations of people. And really no way of proving beyond a reasonable doubt, the way we can today, about who said what to whom and what they meant by it. But nevertheless, you have done an amazing job as far as I'm concerned, and I hope by the end of these series of programs, the viewers is concerned as well. You have done an excellent job of developing a logical train of history over an extensive period of time. So John, let's just start off. Who are you? What are you? And what do you believe?
Well, number one, Dan, and first of all, thanks for having me on your forum here. This is a great opportunity. But first of all, I'm an average American. There's really nothing special about me. I was born and raised in Charlotte, North Carolina. Brought up in public school system. Brought up with the belief systems that America was John Wayne, apple pie, God and country. We always wore the white hat as Americans. We were a nation of freedom. We weren't socialists. We weren't communists. Communism was always our enemy. And I just believed that because that's what I was taught. And I was kind of insulated from the real world. You know, my first real job was with the United Parcel Service. I got into management there. You know, then I got into construction. I got into management and construction also. And when you're insulated, you don't see the taxation. You don't see how the laws affect you. There's a lot that you don't really see. And really around 1990, the economy was bad. I went out and I went to work for myself, away from the building homes. And I realized we were in a socialist country by the amount of taxation we had. It just floored me. Once I had to pay it myself, it just was astronomical. And so that got me questioning what I've been taught, because, you know, versus reality. And now I'm beginning to see something that's not meshing here. We're supposed to be free, low taxation, high taxation as the other countries. And so I started researching. At this point, I'm probably, I don't know, I'm in my 30s, questioning America, what's going on. And I started researching into what was wrong with America, and I started seeing lots of other things. I started getting out. I was liberal at the time. I bought into the liberal belief system, some of the New Age beliefs and things of this nature. I was, again, I guess that typical American going in those directions. And I basically came to the conclusion that if I want to find out what's happening in America, I've got to do the study myself, because I wasn't trusting what people call at the time the patriot belief system, or the government, you know, system, or the education system. Is like I'm getting conflicting concepts of what's going on. So I started doing my own study. And so this led me, and I'm not going to go through that, all of that, but it just led me to getting involved in a study group. We got a group of people together, and every week we'd bring a document in and read it. And what does this mean? And we started our study like that. We did that for years, of just a group of us. What happened in America?
Well, you know, it's interesting because my upbringing really mirrored yours as well. I was brought up in a family situation, public school educated. Roy Rogers, John Wayne, Hopalong Cassidy.
There
I
you
mean,
go.
you know, back in those days, your heroes rode horses.
Right.
And, you know, when I was growing up, I wanted a horse. I mean, that was it. I mean, you know, I said to my mom and dad, if I don't have a horse, I mean, I'm not an American hero. And so we grew up in a time when America had true heroes. And they were the true heroes that did wear a white hat.
Right.
Absolutely always. So what you're coming from and what I'm coming from is really the same. You talked about being a liberal early, and it's easy to do that. It's easy to want to help people, to understand that it is morally right to want to help people.
Right.
And that there's nothing morally wrong with helping people. The problem comes when the government inserts itself into the equation. And then it's not charity. Because when a guy is holding a gun at your back and stealing your wallet, it is not an act of charity, is it?
Oh, not at all.
It's an act of theft.
Right.
And so we have kind of had that metamorphosis between the charity that came when we were young. If you had a problem or someone in your community had a problem, their family, your family, the church, or the community came together to help them out. And that is true charity.
Right.
It is true charity because it is not forced, it is not coerced. What we have now is something that's entirely different. You mentioned that you were a liberal, and I'll just say to you, again, if you're under 30 and you're not a liberal, you have no heart. If you're over 30 and you're still a liberal, you have no brain. And that really comes from the logic, and that's what your study group really
Right.
was looking into the logical basis of how you should behave, how governments should behave.
When you start getting a track record, by the time you get to be 30, your idealistic views that, hey, if you just give this guy a hand, he'll use that and work his way out. And then with time you find out, well, some people you can give a hand and it helps. Some people you give a hand and they just want more, and they want more. And then they just go to the next person, and you start getting experience and finding out there's a human nature here that some people you just can't bring out of their condition.
You know, I'm kind of full of aphorisms today, but what you just reminded me of that one is if you give a man a fish, you'll feed his family for a day. If you teach a man to fish, he'll feed his family for a lifetime.
Right.
And that's really what we're talking about here. So what kind of things did you find in your study group? What was of interest to you? What kind of documents were you looking at? And what kind of conclusions did you come to?
Well, the document that got me started, the one that really piqued my interest, was a Senate report. And it was Senate Report 93-549. And it basically said, it was a 1973 United States Senate report, and it said that a majority of the Americans have lived all their lives under emergency rule, you know, and that we're living in this permanent state of national emergency. And I'm like, wait a second. Okay, that's 1973. I was in high school. We're living under emergency rule. Well, what is emergency rule? Well, government operates in one of two modes. It's either emergency mode, to where we've got to put aside some of the freedoms and constitutional protections and due processes of law to deal with what's supposed to be a temporary emergency. And then you've got wartime, or when you have to, okay, now we're in an emergency, we've got to get away. So you either have peacetime or wartime. And this is basically telling us that we're in this permanent state of constitutional suspension. And it gave a direction in there. It says, actions taken by the government in times of great crisis have, from at least the Civil War, in important ways shaped the present phenomenon of a permanent state of national emergency. Well, that got me thinking, you know, one of the problems we have, you know, my organization is called America's Remedy. And that's a very ambiguous term. Remedy of what? Remedy of feeding the children, remedy of getting rid of the poor, remedy of what? And so you got to ask a couple questions. What are you trying to remedy? And remedy requires two things: understanding the problem, and then remedy also requires having a desired outcome. Okay, you have to target what is the problem, and then what is the outcome we want. Now, I say the problem that I'm addressing with America's Remedy is an unaccountable, ever-expanding, tyrannical government that dictates from a few, Washington, to the masses, and it operates outside the law. You know, the law being the Constitution. It doesn't operate within that framework. And so if that's what I'm saying is the problem, then what is the desired outcome? Well, the desired outcome is accountable, limited government that operates within the law, where government is more locally, it comes from the local level, the state level, and it really puts back in place the 9th and 10th Amendments where we have states' rights, people their laws are coming from the state level. So that's the problem and the desired solution, outcome.
Well, we know that that really was the desire of the Founding Fathers.
Right.
Thomas Jefferson, probably more than any of them, understood the fact that government has to emanate from the bottom up. Right. And that's the way the Constitution was written. The Republic is based upon the local communities having the most of the say, and so that is your basis of power. It is a bottom-up power structure, not a top-down power structure. And so decisions made locally affect local people.
Right.
And that's why you need to make decisions locally. And you're right, we have departed so far from that model that we now are having the problems that come, the loss of freedom that comes from instead of a limited government,
right,
an all-powerful central government. So if I would say to you that what we should have would be limited government, individual freedom, personal responsibility, fiscal restraint, and free market economy, you'd probably be on board with that.
I'd be on board with that. Absolutely
Okay.
on board with that. Basically, what I got is let's bring back constitutional government. And there's two concepts. I mean, did our constitutional government just through a bad decision here, a bad ruling here, a bad politician here, just kind of wiggle our way to where we're at, to where, in other words, is the system broken? And a lot of people say the system is broken. Or is there a different problem? Has the system been overthrown? Has what our founders been put in place, was it totally overthrown and something's new here that looks like, and they say is what our founders put in place, and they convince us that nothing's really changed, that we're really just perfecting what the founders put into place, or was it overthrown? And what I'm going to prove to you, hopefully, is that it was overthrown. We didn't meander our way out. What our founders put into place is dead. It's gone. There is no way to touch that. And so this gives us, the problem is if we have a problem and we want to remedy it, there's three ways to remedy it. You're either going to have a political way to remedy it. Let's get out there, let's get our political action committee together, let's run people for office, let's get, however many power brokers we can and get as many people, in other words, try to do it politically. Or you can do it legally. What happens if there was a violation of a law that all you got to do is get a ruling on it? And we're going to say that we're going to only recognize laws that were passed lawfully rather than Congress passing things outside the law. So you have political remedy, you have a legal remedy. The legal remedy is the one that I'm going to lean towards, and then you have the third remedy, which is just revolution, which is force. We don't like this system, let's get a bunch of people together and throw it out by force, which has always been throughout history, what has happened too many times to count. And I'm not in favor of that because we have good source documents, we have good foundational documents. We just have a problem that if we understand what happened, like I said, when I read that Senate Report 93-549, here I am reading this thing that, we lived all our lives under emergency rule. I cannot solve a problem if I don't know it exists. If I don't know we're under emergency rule, how am I going to sit there and try to solve that problem? So you got to know what the problem is. And history, one of the problems with history is you can go to the original source documents and you can even read what one person says, and it's still through the lens of the person.
Right.
Like right now, in 2010, if I were to go and get people to write a biography of Barack Obama, and I had that biography written by Joe Biden or Barney Frank, would it be a different autobiography or biography than if I had it written by, Glenn Beck, Rush Limbaugh, Sean Hannity? Okay, they're hearing the exact same words, but the lens of what they're looking through, and because Barack Obama saying, "I'm going to save the world, I'm going to save the children, we're going to have health care, and it's going to bring down the deficit," and it's like, it's absurd if you actually put rationality to it. So you still have to put a legal interpretation and a rational interpretation even on through the lenses that people are looking at it.
I think that's a very important observation. And you know, some of the ways that people eschew the written word is very subtly by how they place an adjective, how they make a turn of phrase, how they place their words in the sentences. All of those things really have something to do with how you understand the sentence that's written. So you could have two biographies written of a famous person, and the facts would all be the same.
Right.
But how they are presented and what words, that's what gives you the impression of what you're actually listening to.
Right, and that's the lens you've got to, and that's why a legal remedy, you know, I go political remedies. You get all political remedies deal with how do we manipulate people to believe what I believe.
Right.
I mean, they get these focus groups of how do we get the right words that make you feel good about this policy. Not looking at the policy, but the words. It's like getting the luscious bacon, crunchy, golden brown cheeseburger. Well, it's a cheeseburger, okay? Or I can put all those words out there and make you want it. Okay, I haven't changed it. It's a cheeseburger, but I just put the words out that trigger good thoughts, and people do that with you know, like Barack Obama. Change you can believe in. Okay.
Well,
good words, but
I mean, but that's really what our country has devolved into, is a soundbite society,
right.
where people are really being manipulated by sound bites, by images, and there are people who make very good money and make very good living, forcing us to believe certain things based upon how they're portrayed. Right. And it's not just in political, as you said, it's in all advertising. Right. Really comes down to that. And now politics has become nothing more than an advertising charade to get us to believe one thing, that one guy is going to do something that he may or may not do, because when he gets into Washington, he's going to do whatever he's paid to do, basically, by the people who have the money. So we're going to talk then about a legal remedy for our problems. So you have to be lawyer extraordinaire, legal eagle beagle, legal extraordinaire. You have to be, and I would say that what's going to happen is that you really have to make an extraordinarily strong case.
You have to make an extraordinarily strong case.
You're dealing with a judicial system which is in and of itself tainted.
And hostile.
And hostile, because it is in many instances populated by people who are there for political reasons rather than judicial reasons. Right. So you are about to embark upon, okay, a legal brief with us.
Legal and philosophical. I'm going into some philosophical concepts.
Well, but that's okay, because you're going to be developing a legal brief that has philosophical background to it, so that we can try to understand how we can go about recapturing, reestablishing a really excellent and nearly perfect system of government, which gives us what we really all cherish, and that is individual freedom. And individual freedom.
Individual freedom under God.
Individual freedom under God could be, and you know, and that's a very important point, because the founders understood that you needed to have moral character to be free. And that was the essence, really, of freedom. It was based on several things. It was based on the lack of external coercion. If I were to say to you, what is freedom? You might have a lot of different definitions. My definition is freedom is the lack of external coercion. And I said external because the founders understood that you needed internal coercion to be free, and that internal coercion is called a conscience.
Right.
And that conscience comes from a belief in a certain set of moral guidelines. I like to, for instance, think of the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments are really not a religious document. It is a moral code that we all need to live by. And that's what the founders were after. They were saying, here's a moral code. We're giving you a freedom that's based on morality. And if you maintain the morality, then you will continue to have freedom.
And what we have changed into from our foundation, what I'm going to present here, is we went from a nation of people under God, freedom, having freedom under God, to freedom regardless of God. I'm free to do whatever I want to, get your God out of here. And that's the fundamental change that took place. And we're going to see whether that happened by coercion or by the consent of the people. And I will say it was done by coercion.
I would agree with you.
I'm willing to.
You see, you don't have to. You don't have to go that far to convince me because I understand. But I do. I think it's important that we go through step by step a logical presentation of the logic and philosophy of what you have to say.
Yeah, and one thing I want to say again, right before we get started here, is that there's been this universal concept or belief that politicians are liars. They deceive. They manipulate. They promise one thing and they do whatever it takes to, whatever they want to, whatever their personal beliefs are once they're elected. And they'll throw their constituents under the bus. And we see we've got a long history of that in America. And it seems like we have these sacred periods of time to where, at least one sacred period of time, I could name a couple, but I'm not going to go there, but one where we're not allowed to go there because we said, well, in this period of time, the politicians, even though they might not have done the right thing totally, they were operating under a moral good, and they were being good, and they were being moral and honest and just, and they had to do some really tough decisions to make America better. And what I'm talking about is a period of 1861 to 1868, the American Civil War and Reconstruction. And unfortunately, in this age of political correctness, if you start talking about the Civil War in any way, shape, or form, questioning the federal position of it, then all of a sudden you're labeled a racist, you're labeled, you want to bring back slavery, you want to, and all these people just start attacking you to where you cannot have honesty in debate. You cannot have honesty. Let's just talk about, whoa, put your feelings on the shelf for just like an hour or two, and let's start talking about this and see if there might be something under this rock that called that time frame that needs to be explored.
Well, that's one of the reasons that I'm really glad that you're here, because it's important for people to be able to put aside the name calling,
right,
put aside the labels, and try to get an understanding of the logical train of thought, logical philosophical basis for some of the things that have happened in this country over a period of time. If you cannot understand what went wrong in order to fix it, if you won't open your mind to the logic.
Right.
And so
that's it.
I'm handing you the key.
Well, let's go ahead and get started.
Okay.
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 Okay, where I'm going to start right now is going to be, I'm going to start with a United States Supreme Court ruling, which just gives us a little guideline. This has no legal weight in my arguments, but it just gives some good, sound advice. This is a U.S. Supreme Court case from 1950. It's called Communications Associations versus Dowds, and this was dealing with the communist issues of 1950. But the United States Supreme Court said this. It says, progress generally begins in skepticism about accepted truths. I'm reading this. Intellectual freedom means the right to re-examine much that has been long taken for granted. A free man must be a reasoning man, and he must dare to doubt what a legislative or electoral majority may most passionately assert. The danger that citizens will think wrongly is serious, but less dangerous than atrophy from not thinking at all. And I think we can relate to that in this modern time of people, just not really thinking a whole lot. It says, our Constitution relies on our electorate's complete ideological freedom to nourish independent and responsible intelligence and preserve our democracy from that submissiveness, timidity, and herd-mindedness of the masses, which would foster a tyranny of mediocrity. The priceless heritage of our society is the unrestricted constitutional right of each member to think as he will. Thought control is a copyright of totalitarianism, and we have no claim to it. It is not the function of our government to keep the citizen from falling into error. It's the function of the citizen to keep the government from falling into error. And again, I want to mention here, thought control is a copyright of totalitarianism, they say here. And how do we have thought control today? Because we have it terribly, and that's in political correctness. What you can say is they have gotten us to where we are so self-censoring because I'm afraid to say something that will offend someone, You know, I'd rather be able to say what I want to say, what I feel I need to say, and be called a jerk, you know, rather than I can't say what I truly believe because someone's going to get offended and say I'm committing some hate crime.
What I would like to know is where in the Constitution does it say that we have a right not to be offended?
It doesn't.
It doesn't. And that's what you're talking about is really true. Thought censoring and, you know, this kind of political correctness is not allowing people to be free in terms of expression, in terms of writing. Really, First Amendment issues here are at stake.
It's what we used to think of as the old Soviet control of what they could write, what the Soviet citizens could write without getting in trouble with the government. We have the exact same thing here saying it's freedom.
It's
It's insanity what's going on here.
It's also 1984, George Orwell, and with his, you know, correct speech and
What's 2 + 2, Winston?
That's right. Whatever the government says it is.
Whatever it says.
Well, and that's one of the problems with the progressive movement is that they want to question specific truths. And they're, in terms of 2 + 2, they would tell you that if a group of experts got together and decided that 2 + 2 is 5, then 2 + 2 is in fact 5 because a group of experts says it's 5.
Right. And if you go to 1984, 2 + 2 is 5. That was the concept that they were pushing.
Right.
Big Brother was pushing on Winston. And you saw that the conflict was within Winston's own mind. Of like, I know 2 + 2 is 4. I know 2 + 2 is
Right.
4. But the world, everyone, I talked to my friends, and they're like, 2 + 2 is 5. And you see this conflict, and it sounds so absurd, but it's happening to us today.
Absolutely, in spades. It is happening to us today more than you can ever imagine.
And so we're in a society without honesty. We're in a society without openness. We're in a society where political correctness, in other words, who has a political power to imprison other people who go against their belief system, they can control what you can say and what the papers can publish. And America's going in a direction I would have never thought about 25 years ago.
So political correctness obviously is the enemy of free speech.
It is definitely one of the enemies of free speech, absolutely. And we are living in a climate that is so politically correct, it's unbelievable. So again, what we want to do is, so we have limitations of what we can practically say, unfortunately in America, in order to carry on a dialogue to try to move forward. But I will cross some lines that I'm sure people will say I'm a terrible, awful person for, but I mean, I guess I have to take that heat. But again, let's keep going. And what we want to talk about is knowledge. We want to talk about people's duty to learn what it takes to get out of this situation. And I've got a James Madison quote from 1822. And he says, "Knowledge will forever govern ignorance. And a people who mean to be their own governors must arm themselves with the power of which knowledge gives." And so we have to start getting this knowledge base in order to get back. And one of the things we have to understand is political views. Now, what we have in this country, we have one flag, it's the American flag, but we have a multitude of political views. You've got communists who want to dominate the country. You've got socialists that want to dominate the country. You've got fascists who want to dominate the country. You've got New Age people. You've got Muslims. You've got illegal immigrants who want to come in with their views and get involved in the political process. Well, the way this nation was originally founded, you had body politics who had a common political belief system. Now we have this concept of a diverse political belief system. And we hear these concepts like we get our strength through diversity. Well, that's a lie. We get our strength through fracturing, through people not getting along. If we get our strength through diversity, then the Middle East should be the most strong, solidified place on the planet. And it's not. You can't bring in these political views, these opposing political views, in one body and have it work. The only way you can make that work is with an iron hand. If you look at Yugoslavia, and then once the communists break down, all of a sudden you had infighting in there with the people are free from the iron hand of government, and now they're fighting. You go to Iran or Iraq, you know, where you have the Kurds and the Sunnis and the Shiites. Well, all of a sudden, the iron hand of Saddam's off. Now they're fighting each other. And so this concept of we can all be, you know, we want as much diversity, is it doesn't create strength.
You know, it's an interesting thing that you bring up this point, because 100 years ago, my grandparents were legal immigrants to this country. They had one desire, and that was to be part of the American dream and to be part of that great melting pot of American society. So when that concept was in place, which was, you know, 100 years ago, people came here and they were put in the melting pot, because in the melting pot, everyone then becomes as one.
Assimilate into our society.
Exactly, and the concept of hyphenated Americanism does not exist. So, in essence, the creation of the hyphenated American is a way to enforce diversity as opposed to assimilation.
Assimilation. And that's the big difference, and that's a huge difference, is we think that people from other countries should be able to come here and then put their political views onto our system, when our system was what was the beacon of what people wanted to come to get away from those belief systems that are in their countries. And so we actually have the breakdown of America through these concepts of accepting diversity and accepting every belief, and every belief is valid and every political view is valid. That is, you know, we have a right to think what we want, but if America is what everyone wants, the American dream, then they need to become American, not come here with their views and break us down to old world views that have proven to fail.
And actually, that very concept is what is related to the speech problems, to political correct speech. Right. It's all related to the whole diversity issue. But we digress. But again, what I want to go to, we're talking about political views, and that's what we're talking about, this diversity, diverse political views. Well, in America, the original 13 colonies, you had two flags flying over America in 1776, 1777. One was what we call the Betsy Ross flag, what you have on your lapel, and the other was the Queen Anne's flag, the British flag with the red body to it. Well, they represented two political views, and the people had to decide, which political view do I want to attach to? Which one do I want to fight for? You know, the concept of free local self-government or being a subject to the crown. Okay? Two totally different political views. And the political body that won was the freemen of the several states who fought for independence from the crown, saying that government should emanate from the people. And so that's the body politic that fought and died and gave us what we cherish so much from our founders. And again, I'm going back to, right now I'm going back to Senate Report 93-549. I want to talk about a little bit about political views, that you want to have a political body politic. We're going to bring that up a little bit later. But again, Senate Report 93-549 from 1973. This is what led me, and I'm going to read this sentence again. I stated it earlier. It says, in the United States, actions taken by the government in times of great crisis have, from at least the Civil War, in important ways shaped the present phenomenon of a permanent state of national emergency. The Civil War is you know, we deviated. Something big happened in the Civil War, which has created what we have as a permanent state of constitutional suspension. I think that's a big deal, personally. And that piqued my interest and made me, you know, search further into what's going on. On page 184 of this document, it says this, and again, this is the Senate Report 93-549, talking about the overthrow of what our foundation was. And it says this, it says, the President, with the approval of Congress, is thus used as authority for extraordinary actions, laws which have no real relationship whatsoever to existing circumstances. As a consequence, a national emergency is now a practical necessity in order to carry out what has become the regular and normal method of governmental action. What were intended by Congress as delegations of power to be used only in the most extreme situations and for the most limited durations have become everyday powers, and a state of emergency has become a permanent condition.
This is page 184 of the United States Senate report. Is that a credible source? I think it is. Something that we need to take heed. But again, you cannot solve a problem if you don't know it exists. Well, there's another interesting document. This is called the Williamsburg Resolves. The Williamsburg Resolve came from the Republican Governors Conference of 1994. I'm just going to read the opening sentence of this from the Republican Governors Conference. It says, "Here and in other colonial capitals, the nation's founders first debated the idea of independence and the fundamental principles of freedom. Then the challenge to the liberties of the people came from an arrogant, overbearing monarchy across the sea. Today, that challenge comes from our own federal government, a government that has defied and that now ignores virtually every constitutional limit fashioned by the framers to confine its reach and thus guard the freedoms of the people." So now you have the Republican governors in 1994 saying the federal government defies and ignores every constitutional limit. Well, the Constitution is the foundational law, and saying the federal government is defying the law. Well, what do you and I call someone who defies the law and does things outside the law? We call that a criminal or criminal action, a crime. But this is what these crimes have become everyday actions.
And when they become everyday actions, presumably they become acceptable drip by drop by drip by drop.
Absolutely. And we know if you have a constitution, the government can operate in one of two modes, within the Constitution or outside the Constitution.
Right.
Okay? If they operate outside the Constitution and they start enacting laws that are opposed to the Constitution, that's called an unconstitutional act. Well, let's just define an unconstitutional act. Here's what the United States Supreme Court says about an unconstitutional act, because now we're building our legal defense of, we're going to start looking for unconstitutional acts, and we want to know what an unconstitutional act does in law. Here's the United States Supreme Court in Norton versus Shelby County. It says an unconstitutional act is not a law. It confers no rights. It imposes no duties. It affords no protection. It creates no office. It is in legal contemplation as inoperative as though it had never been passed. Therefore, an unconstitutional act purporting to create an office gives no validity to the acts of persons acting under color of its authority. So an unconstitutional act creates nothing in law. The only thing it does create is a perceived law. It can be perceived as a law, and people can obey it, but in law, do they have an obligation to obey it? Or do they have a duty to obey it? Does the law force them to obey it, or are they obeying it just because out of ignorance, or maybe they like the unconstitutional act? The next thing I want to show is what I call the law graph of what this nation was first founded, the order upon which America was set up. Again, we were a nation under God. The way this law graph works is we're dealing with, where does law come from? Does law come from God, or does the law come from man? Our nation founder said law comes from God. And it says God is a creator. And a creator, the created, can never violate the creator. You know, the creator creates. You can do whatever you want to under the creator, but you cannot violate the creator. The created cannot. And God created God's laws. God does not violate God's laws. Under God's laws, God created man. And God allows man to do anything he wants as long as he doesn't violate God's laws. And man is authorized to make man's laws. And man can make man's laws as long as they don't violate man, murder, theft, things of this nature, or God's laws. And then we go down, in this country, man created state constitutions. The state constitution, by their mere creation, created the state citizen. And in the United States, these state constitutions, these several states got together, the several states, and created a federal government. And again, they created the federal government to be there to benefit them, not to overthrow them. Okay, the federal government is a creation of the states. And the states said the federal government is authorized by the Constitution to do certain things, but it cannot operate outside of that. It's going to be a limited government. And the way this graph is set up, you'll see right there in the middle, you have Articles 1 through 7, which is the main body of the Constitution, and then you have the Bill of Rights. And what these lines are on this are, if you see the lines that go to the squares, those are laws that are passed in conformity with the Constitution and within the bounds. And what you see there is you'll start to see the very first one where the very first circle is. And that's an unconstitutional act. And what we're going to point to is this point in time, this one unconstitutional act, and through that unconstitutional act, other unconstitutional entities and administrations and laws are created to support the unconstitutional act. And you see that this unconstitutional action, and we said actions taken by the government in times of great crisis from at least the Civil War, they've been legislating since the Civil War, creating all sorts of unconstitutional laws, unconstitutional agencies, procedures, and it's turned our nation upside down to where now God is on the bottom. This cancer, this federal cancer of unconstitutionality is running this nation. The federal government says it's in charge. The states are underneath them. And in fact, we're going to make God so far down the list that we're not even going to recognize God anymore. We're going to take him off the walls. We're not, and we have a total upside down based off of this unconstitutional act.
Well, this is what really speaks to the whole concept of natural law rights. And that's what the founders of our country knew was so important, that these rights were to be secured and protected by the government, but they did not derive from the government. So what you have described is the way things should be. In other words,
Right.
a broad-based foundation of the people obeying God's natural laws, and then they build the superstructure above that. But what you have said, and very correctly so, is that in order to turn that whole structure upside down, which is what has happened, you have to get people to understand or to think that those rights do not come from God,
Right.
that they come from the government.
Right.
And that is where the battle lines are drawn at this moment.
And that's where they are. And we want to find out what is that problem? What's that root problem? Because when you look at that graph, you're seeing all these circles. And let's say one of them underneath the Second Amendment is Brady Bill. Well, you get the NRA, you get Gun Owners of America. They're spending hundreds of thousands of man-hours, millions and millions of dollars to fight that one circle. Okay? And then you get the people with the sanctity of marriage. Let's get a constitutional amendment for, say, a marriage is between a man and a woman. And you get people spending hundreds of thousands of man-hours and millions of dollars and trying to get political action committees together to fight that one circle. Well, what I'm saying is, let's fight the root cause. Let's hack at the root. Let's find, what is that one line that I just showed you there that starts that circle that just took our country totally out. And that's a legal argument. It's not a political argument. I'm saying if it's an unconstitutional act, it becomes a legal argument, and we have legal recourse, which means we don't have to go through political action committees. We don't have to fight every one of the circles. We hack the one, everything falls away.
Yeah. Okay, where were we?
Okay, and so what we're dealing with is that the root cause. What is the root cause? And so that I don't blindside you and take you off through a long list, I'm going to say it's Reconstruction. At the end of the Civil War, it's the federal government had the states in a position that they could do things because of the political climate in total violation of the Constitution, and people let it happen thinking that, well, they were just in a time to punish states and do things to them and subjugate them. And so with that in mind, let's look at that period of time. Let's look at what Reconstruction did. And what did Reconstruction do? What was the purpose and function of Reconstruction? That was to pass the 14th Amendment. And the 14th Amendment is what we hear a little bit talking about now. We need to amend this thing. That's where anchor babies came from, and we're going to talk about that. But let's just go look at what the 14th Amendment did versus what we're told it did. We're told that the 14th Amendment is one of the three, what were called the Black Amendments. I guess back then they were called the Negro Amendments. Now I guess they're the Slave Amendments, the Black Amendments, I don't know. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. That was 1865. 1868, 3 years later, the 14th Amendment is passed. Then 1870, the 15th Amendment, the 15th Amendment is passed. 13th, 14th. 13th abolished slavery. 14th supposedly gave blacks civil rights. And the 15th Amendment gave blacks the right to vote. Okay.
So the important concept is that the 14th Amendment really had nothing to do with abolishing slavery.
14th Amendment had nothing to do with abolishing slavery. If you get rid of the 14th Amendment, you're not bringing back slavery. Slavery was abolished in December of 1865. 14th Amendment was passed in July of 1868. So you're dealing with almost, well, 2.5 years difference between them. So they're not associated, but people will automatically associate them for some reason. So we're told the 14th Amendment was designed to give blacks civil rights. Well, let's look at some Supreme Court cases and see what the 14th Amendment has ruled upon. Well, if we go to Lawrence versus Texas out of 2003, that's the one that struck down the sodomy laws and said that, which is opening the door for gay rights. Lawrence was a white man. He was not a black man. So again, the 14th Amendment was applied in Lawrence versus Texas, which opened the door for the gay marriage stuff. Had nothing to do with black rights. We've got Roe versus Wade. Roe, the abortion laws, the anti-abortion laws, were struck down as unconstitutional through the 14th Amendment based on Roe versus Wade. Roe was a white woman. You've got Stone versus Graham. This is a 1980 case which says the display of the Ten Commandments is unconstitutional through the 14th Amendment. It wasn't because it was objectionable to blacks. It was the 14th Amendment said that everyone's equal. And we talk about this doctrine of equality, and people say, well, it was to make blacks equal to whites. Well, that's not what the 14th Amendment is, to make everyone equal. The atheist equal to the Christian, the illegal immigrant equal to the legal immigrant, the citizen equal to the illegal immigrant. It just goes across the board. It made the atheist equal to the Christian, the Muslim equal to the Christian, where when we had a Christian foundation, it nullified all of that. So the 14th Amendment nullified states' rights, it nullified the Christian government, it nullified virtually everything our foundation was set upon. And then you've got the case which I think is in the public mind today, and that's Wong Kim Ark case, 1898 case, which this was a Chinaman. He was born to citizens of the Emperor of China, but he's born in the United States, and he left the country and tried to come back in. They said, no, you're a Chinaman. You cannot come back in. He says, 14th Amendment says all persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens of the United States. That applies to Chinamen also. And so it went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled that, okay, if you're born here, you become a citizen of the United States. So the concept of anchor babies, if you're born here, you become a citizen, comes out of the 14th Amendment.
So I want to clarify an important point here, in that the 14th Amendment has absolutely nothing to do with slavery.
Slavery was abolished.
Because slavery was abolished by the 13th Amendment
Right.
two plus years ahead of the 14th Amendment.
Absolutely.
Impact. So if someone were to say to you that you were pro-slavery because that you thought the 14th Amendment was not a good idea or whatever, that would be incorrect, because that issue had already been dealt with prior by the 13th Amendment.
Yeah, what you're going to find is government works best when it can agitate and divide people up. In North Carolina, let's just talk about North Carolina. That's where I'm from. North Carolina, free blacks were allowed to vote before the Civil War in North Carolina. Okay, free blacks could vote from the time of the Revolution all the way up to the Civil War. So the concept that this was designed to give blacks, they had them in North Carolina. Not all states allowed free blacks to vote.
Well, that goes back to the fact that we were a country of individual states
Right.
with individual states' rights.
Right.
And so, yes, you could have rights in one state that would not necessarily, or a state could do something that the other state might not necessarily do.
And the best way to make an analogy of that would be the European Union, because here's something we can relate to a little bit better. Is you've got France, you've got Germany, they're in a union, like we were in a union of several states. A state is a nation. The European Union is a union of states, the German state, the French state, the British state, and they have local self-government. What the laws of a Frenchman don't apply to the laws of a German or the laws of a Dane. They get to do whatever they want to within their borders. And that's how we were set up. You could freely cross between your state lines, your state borders, but the laws of the state were the laws of the state, totally governed by them. It wasn't controlled by The Hague.
Well, and let's take it one step further, because according to our Constitution, the individual states gave a body of obligations, or not rights, but powers to a federal government that were severely limited. And anything that wasn't specifically enumerated in Article 1, Section 8 as a power of the federal government was reserved very specifically to the states and the people
Right.
of the several states, which goes along exactly with what you were saying. And I would say that the European Union now is an example of that, is that each individual country gave a series of powers to an overall umbrella, the European Union, but they retained rights for themselves, which
Right.
could not be violated, which is what our Constitution did for us.
Right, and think about some of the analogies. European Union, let's have a common currency, the euro. In us, let's have a common currency rather than North Carolina minting money, coining
Right.
money in New York. Let's go to a common currency. Let's have one body that deals with other countries for treaties and trade, rather than North Carolina dealing with France and New York dealing with France and Louisiana dealing with France, all with their own treaties. No, as a body, we're going to have this one body that deals with these other nations as a business, or marketing and things of this nature. And so you've got that going on. And you see, it's a very good analogy, the European Union as it is now, to what we had prior to the Civil War. And what the Civil War did, and again, I'm going to give you a hint of what I'm going to prove, is it annulled states' rights, it annulled the Ninth Amendment, it annulled the 10th Amendment, and it did this by nationalizing citizenship. It made everyone a citizen of Washington. And is nationalization of citizenship a big issue? And how did it get rid of states' rights? Well, think about it. If you have a citizen of Washington, a citizen of the District of Columbia, who has a right to an abortion, and they happen to live in Texas, does a United States citizen have that same right in New York, in North Carolina, and South Carolina? Well, that's it right there, is the annulment of states' rights. Texas, you can have, if a United States citizen has that right there, if they move wherever they want to, they're going to have that exact same right. It's the annulment of states' rights is the 14th Amendment through the nationalization of citizenship. Same thing with gay marriage. That's the one thing we're fighting now. It's kind of currently in the news. And if the United States has a right to be married in Massachusetts, and that couple moves to North Carolina, that has to be recognized. And then North Carolina. So again, North Carolina cannot have a state right of, well, we don't recognize that under the 14th Amendment, under this nationalization of citizenship. And again, that's a preview of where we're going. And what we want to do is, again, let's attack this Reconstruction. Let's attack the root. Let's flip everything right back over. Let's turn America and put God back on top, and get the federal government back as a limited federal government again.
But let me play devil's advocate for 1 minute. You have to have some regularization of, not rights, rights is a bad word, but of in people among the states. In other words, if you were, for instance, a man and a woman married in North Carolina, their marriage should be able to be recognized in other states.
Right. Oh, absolutely.
And similarly, like with driver's licenses, if I have a driver's license from North Carolina, I shouldn't lose that license when
There's
I
some
cross.
reciprocal agreements.
And those would be reciprocal agreements among states based upon the wishes of the people in the state. The ultimate states' right issue is the ability of citizens in a state to decide what they want to be the law in their state, and to agree with other states on similar laws where they can agree. And if they didn't agree, then they didn't agree, because the citizens of North Carolina are not obligated to say, we'll do everything that the citizens of New York do.
I think it's an absolute absurdity to think that the citizens of Wyoming should be regulated the exact same way as the citizens of New York City.
Exactly right.
I mean, it's absurd.
Well, that is the
They have
essence.
different needs.
Well, that's the essence of state rights.